Anyway, to start us off for the next session, I'm going to start off with Ajamu.
So can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. So first of all, thank you, OP. So I get this email from OP around dating with difference. And I'm like, oh, dating with OP, nice, speed dating. And then, I realize it's this kind of way of bringing artists to come and talk about their work. And so basically, I've always kept away from speed dating type events. But there was something that I felt that I wanted to be kind of part of. And so thank you, OP. And thank you to my dates, Sabrina and Caroline. We've had 2 dates, and we've only had 1 on Skype, but then that's okay. So basically, what I'm going to do for the next kind of 10 minutes or so is I'm trying to give you a quick and dirty overview of my practice and try to share with you some of the ideas that I've been exploring around difference, yeah? And for me, it's about I'm just around difference in terms of race, sexuality, and gender, but it's how do we talk about difference in a relation to pleasure and joy and the erotic. So that's the space that my work kind of plays in, and I think for me, my first sting of difference wasn't around race. It wasn't around sexuality or around gender. It was around growing up with a stutter, yeah? And then basically, that's when I knew that I stood apart slightly from other people. So basically, in a roundabout way, the photograph that became the visual voice that I started to work with. So this is a quote from Audre Lorde. A lot of my work is around creating work around a black, queer, LGBT experience. Now then, I move in and out of queer as an identity, but I'm trying to talk about queer as a kind of a politic that I've been exploring. And part of the work is around what are the kind of images I do not see as a black gay man born and raised in the context of a UK. Where are the images around black male pleasure, intimacy? Rarely do I see images around black and black love, yeah? And for me, and part of the work is also saying, while some of us are out around our sexual identity, and we might be isolated around as I'm someone who is part of the kink scene as well. My work is about I'm drawing out those stories that we don't hear around black experiences and queer experiences, and so kink turns up a lot in my work as well. And then basically, I would argue while we spend a lot of time talking about sexuality, we don't talk about sex, yeah? And for me, that's the place that my work goes to, is I actually want to talk about sex. I want to talk about the body. I want to talk about pleasure. I want to talk about the dirt. All the things that I think our politics around difference actually exclude, yeah? So then my work is then about saying, actually, there's this space that I like to play in, yeah, right? And the work then also includes portraits and self-portraits as well. And this is Karim Reed, who does lots of work around curriculum. I'm spaces for young black and LGBT queers. And the studio is the place where I kind of work through a lot of my ideas, and a lot of my kind of early work also drew upon pornography as well. It's because this was the first place that I saw black men elating. Kareem and Ibrahim. This was taken, I think, a few years ago. So, so basically the challenge is how do you talk about difference and diversity in a moment when a lot of LGBT politics is mainstreaming, yeah? And then I would argue that as LGBT politics mainstream, I think that it then becomes more cleaned up and more sanitized, yeah? And for me, then there is then lots of kind of narratives or stories then that's left out of that experience. And so once again, there is a kind of space that I'm trying to kind of articulate through the images, but then also the work is not just about the cultural and social drivers. The work is also about how do we then also talk about one's praxis as an artist as well. What are the things that I'm working with, yeah? In terms of the light, large format cameras, working inside a dark room. And for me, one of the challenges about talking about difference in a relation to photography is that I think that lots of black and queer work gets locked into the content only. And then because then the work then gets locked into that, then black and queer work could then be co-opted by spaces to then be used under the umbrella of diversity and inclusion. And then rarely do we hear black and queer artists talk about the actual materiality of their work, the praxis of the work. So then actually, some of my ideas have been shifting back to trying to articulate the dark room, and then of course also as someone interking the photographic dark room is similar to back rooms that I am also fucking as well. Yeah. So then I'm just kind of making these links with different kind of spaces, and the smells of the dark room, the smells of the back rooms, they're very similar. Yeah. It's dark, red light. There's danger of risk with chemicals. So I am kind of work with 19th century printing processes mainly, and then there's a risk in back rooms and play spaces as well. So this is kind of the space that I'm trying to articulate around kind of my kind of praxis. And then within that, it is about how do you then talk about joy and pleasure, yeah, right? And the best way, I'm going to make a grand claim that I think Ajamu thinks that we live in a pleasure-phobic society, and then I think that there is a fear of the erotic as well. So basically, we can talk about racism, homophobia. I also want to talk about erotophobia, the fear of the erotic. So then, with that said, I'm going to jump into my current piece of work, which is a short video, about 6 minutes long. So I'm at the moment I'm working with a young filmmaker, and we're creating these series of quick videos of kind of black queers talking about kind of their bodies and pleasure and joy and so on and so forth. And hopefully this connection will work. So then I'm going to show you Keith J. Sex is Political. So technology, do not embarrass me now. I know you work. Yeah, yeah, I'm sure it is, yeah. Do you want to come check it for me? So then with these Wow. That's not my sound effects that I'm working with, just so you know.
Oh yeah, okay. Let's hope it's not going to make that noise again.
So then this is part of my current projects that I'm now working on. Like the sound. Like the sound somewhere.
My name is Keith Jarrett. I am a writer, poet, performer.
That's on screen. So then I could just play it then, and then it's coming up. Any quick questions while we do this? And this is one reason why I've actually gone back to film. Give me analog any day of the week. Keith J.
And many other things besides. I think the London LGBTQ or the queer scene is really diverse. That's really what sticks out for me if I think about it. It's also very fragmented. It's there's so many different communities, so many different people doing various things, and because London's kind of a spread about city, there's no centre. So how I see myself within that, I would say mostly as a poet and performer. That's interaction with other queer people, and just through day to day, like generally around North London is where I hang out, and certain scenes, certain bars, clubs, a few performance spaces. Particularly now, like there's a lot more spaces for queer people of colour. I think pleasure and joy and the erotic should have absolutely nothing to do with activism or social justice. That's it's a funny question. Of course, I think that we're whole people, and social justice and activism and performance, and as an artist myself, I feel my work is better when I include more of myself, like all of the things that I am, and I am also a individual that enjoys being joyful and enjoys pleasure and sometimes enjoys the erotic. Thanks, man. That's a different question to the one you sent me. What do people find most enjoyable about me in terms of my body? You'll have to ask them. What I find most pleasurable and enjoyable about other people and their bodies, often, this will sound cheesy, but often the eyes and eye contact. I enjoy a good behind as everyone else, but eyes definitely. And about me, I would say for me, like my own thighs, because until quite recently I found them a bit weird, but actually they're strong, they keep me grounded, so yeah. So I'm going to share a poem that I haven't performed in a long while, so I have to read it, and it really talks about how politics and sex go together, whether you like it or not. Sex is politics. My cock is political. My ass is political. My balls are political. When we are fucking working up a sweat, we are political. The bed, the sheets, the handcuffs, political. Your armpits, your nipples, your earlobe, political. The whip, the toys, political. Your neck is an election. The skin tag on your asshole, a hung parliament. The tightening of your sphincter, a coalition government. So when you say fuck politics, you are engaging in rampant sex. Your pubic hair is political. The condom is political. Our bedded union is a sheet under the scrutiny of the masses. We are political because where we can and can't fuck is a legal conundrum. Here we are a civil partnership. Since only recently a marriage, in Sunday's sermon an abomination, in playgrounds a curse word, in courtrooms an incitement, in comments an indiscretion, at the bus stop an indecency, in most of the British Commonwealth an incarceration, and in some a death penalty. When our lips meet, we are engaging in a political narrative, always engorged, raging, never flaccid. And you, my blindfolded, passive friend, are the most political of them all. With your head buried face down, naked from the waist down, your ass an invitation for a succession of governments to own. Your ass an invitation for national inspection. Your ass wide open to new buggery laws in India and Nigeria. Your ass too greedy for my tongue, alone for my cock, alone for my finger, alone. Political. You are political, and when I come and when I've gone, I want you to know that we have just done anonymous politics together.
So that's how I encounter difference, through the body, through pleasure, and through the erotic. You are not part of my conversation. Thank you.
Right, thanks very much. Difference has always been fundamental to my practice, and what I'm going to talk about is the roots of that, my exploration of difference, and also how that exploration of difference has changed my practice. Right, my artist statement talks about how exclusion from mainstream society and objectification actually gives you license and freedom to explore other ways of being and to develop a language of difference. The roots of that exploration of difference go back to my feminism, which started in the early 1970s. And that was an absolutely joyous time. The world was never going to be the same again. We felt really powerful, and we were very much driven by a vision of a better world. There was a lot of activism, peace camps, squats, solidarity with strikes and so on. A lot of organising around needs, like, for instance, the birth of the Women's Aid movement and campaigns for control of our bodies. But what's really stayed with me is my experience of working in non-hierarchical structures and working collectively. And as you'll see in this presentation, I'm not underestimating the complexity of those ideas, but there's something about the practice of doing things together that is a really strong basis for relationships and a focus, building relationships and a focus on our commonalities rather than our differences. Okay, many years later I got involved in photography, and I made some substantial bodies of work which looked at difference from in a very different sort of way, looking at the city. And these bodies of work were gestures against commercial interests which impose order and uniformity on the city. And eventually I went off in 2015 to do my MA in fine art photography at LCC. And I wanted to go back to my feminism, and I wanted to make some collaborative work. So it was project-based, and I made this project that ended up being called I'll Tell You About the Mermaid. And it was an exploration of female subjectivity, and I worked with 12 different women. And what I asked them to do was to choose a setting, and in that place to perform an expression of their subjectivity, their experience of being a woman, and documented that. And then I asked them, why that location, and why did you choose to present yourself in that way? And they were an amazing bunch of women, and I learnt a lot from working with them. But I had a dilemma with that work, because they were choosing how to present themselves. But for me, some of the images that the images that I was making of some of the women seemed to have more to do with conforming to the spectacle of representation rather than undermining or challenging it. And I really wasn't comfortable with that in terms of my own work. Now, for me, it had quite an unexpected resolution, because at the same time I was experimenting with using moving image instead of still photography. And suddenly that opened up all these possibilities for me, the possibilities of using words, of using voice, of using sound, of playing with time, and so on. So in the end, the subjects came out of the film, and what remained was their places, their sounds, and these were juxtaposed with fragments of their testimonies. And those were sort of woven together, incorporating the unsaid, the contradictions, the harmonies and the distances, to be actually a celebration of women and their differences, and tied together with one unifying voice using techniques of verbatim theatre. Okay, that finished, my MA finished at the end of 2015, and the beginning of last 2016, I really needed to, no, the beginning of 2017, sorry, I really needed to get straight on and make some new work. And I made a film called Part of Something Bigger, and it was entirely based on text, image, sound and voice that was taken from Mermaid. And I combined them together to tell the story of my work with one particular of those 12 women. And it explores the issues of representation and complexities of the collaborative process. It deals also with a bit of unfinished business, as you'll see. But the narrative is carried by a series of, it's all real emails or extracts from them. And where we're going to come in, I'm going to play you 2 minutes of a 4.5-minute video, is after we've made contact, we've expressed loads of enthusiasm for working together and documenting what being a woman means. And you're going to hear a voice as well, and that's H. I'm S in the email, she's H, explaining why she chose the setting, which is Oakley Moor, and why she chose to present herself as she did. okay.
I don't know. Maybe we have to go like, there's a path over there.
Yeah.
So we have to go down and then up over there.
Okay.
Sometimes enjoying some moments of being looked at, wanting to hide, wanting to be seen, looking back.
Right, okay. Well, you'll be relieved to hear it all ended happily. H likes the film. We still stay in regular contact, and the only thing was I didn't get to use the pictures I took on that either of those shoots, except in this film with H photoshopped out. So, okay, and then I'm part of a writing and photography group at LCC, and we had a show last year at Elephant and Castle, and I made Flow. It's a 7.5 minute shot of the river as dawn breaks. It's got a voiceover, which is a personal history of and an account of a personal history and of a relationship with the river. But what happens is repeated and repeated and repeated throughout the film, and the words get disorganised and rearranged so that it's repeated with the words in different order, and the personal history decays completely. It's about the construction of identity, subjectivities as mutable and formless. It uses time a lot. The river being tidal flows forwards and backwards, and it uses illusion a lot because you're not really looking at any of those birds or the trees or anything. It also is very, very slow, giving the viewer space for their participation through reflection. And then the final piece that I made last year was Away. It's a stereo sound recording, 4.5 minutes. We got the opportunity to show as part of Deptford X Fringe in the cells at Deptford Old Police Station, which is a most brilliant space. And I wanted to do something site-specific. I wanted to do a sound piece. So I got actual testimonies of women prisoners and then fragmented them up and then got 7 different women to read them in the sense of giving them voice rather than acting them. And the setting was really important because you listen to them in the cell where sound combines with the setting itself, the narrow bed, the covered slops bucket, the acoustic of its unforgiving surfaces, to shift the emphasis from the visual to an encounter or experience for the listener. And I'm going to play you 2 very short extracts from that.
Imprisonment just exploded a bomb.
It was housing that started it all off.
It doesn't really make any sense.
They don't ask me why I'm coming in.
Mixing with people serving life.
I couldn't stop being sick. I was totally frightened.
Meeting all kinds of people.
I hate seeing fights.
I run and lock my door.
Right, what I'm working on at the moment, oh yes, let me take it. Back into the forest again. I'm doing a retelling of a fairy story, looking at intergenerationality. and the agency of older women. I'm making a film about a taxidermist friend of mine. It's not so much about her as mice and slowness. And I'm working collectively, and I'm really pleased about that. There's 4 of us who got awarded the ArtQuest Lifeboat residency, and that means we get a shared studio, and we've got funding for a peer mentoring group with us, 12 of us. We'll all be working together, so I'm very excited about that. And so, whoops, oh, bother. Right, sorry, just bear with me. We go back into slideshow. Slide view, current slide. I hope I've been able to show you that what my work does is explore what I'm meaning by the language of difference, and that's as much about how I work as the work I make. I like to make work that's participative, collaborative, that gives voice to seldom heard voices, that pushes language to its extreme, and that's more experiential, and the use of sound has been really important in that, and I'm really interested in place and time and slowness is giving us the space to reimagine both the present and the future. I talked about the practice of doing. For me, doing is the basis for building relationships. It's the basis for forming alliances. It's a basis for resistance. This whole day and everything that's led up to it has been a fantastic example of doing things together and building relationships, and I'd really like to thank Opie very much for this opportunity. It's been brilliant. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Grace. Slight hooky mistake straight after lunch. We were speaking over lunch about what you leave in and what you leave out in a 15-minute talk. And I guess what I was interested in doing, can you hear me okay? Is just giving you, in a sense, a vignette of my research rather than a finished piece. There's a consistency to a number of pieces that are all interested in issues of representation around the photography studio and how I see it as a politicised space historically and in a contemporary. Now I've got to work out actually how to. No. So this is something I'm working on at the moment, but I guess my argument is if studio photography is a space in which historically it was considered we explored our identity or performed our identity more accurately and showed our social and cultural aspirations. These are carte de vista photographs from about 150 years ago. They're drawn from ethnographic research of British carte de vista photographs, and I was interested in a sense, the background is the foreground. The background tells us more about what that person maybe wants out of that photograph than the person themselves. We've lost, we don't necessarily know who's in the photographs anymore. In fact, these ones, I've taken the people out so we can actually look at the background, look at the objects, look at them in terms of aspiration. And yes, so I guess this piece of work, Studioscapes, explores, if we take out the subject and we actually look at the objects, what's that saying about the photograph as an aspirational space? I also want to add, I've spoken a lot about studio photography over the last 5-10 years with different projects, and I notice there's kind of fetishism when we talk retrospectively about studio photography in a way that we don't necessarily apply to current studio photography. So the reason to include the quote, the Dickens quote, is although retrospectively we might look back and think, oh, that tells us a lot about, you know, the pillars and the aspirations, and we want to be seen in a certain way, or we can see it draws from our historical references of painting at the time. At the time, it wasn't considered, it was kind of considered a little bit cheesy in the same way we might think of that today in contemporary studio photography. So Studioscapes draws from a book of studio photography, British photography, that looks at the front and the back of studio photographs and looks for repetitions in objects as a way of talking about what was aspirational in Britain, particularly English studio photographs at that time. I still don't quite know how I move on slide, sorry. Right, okay. So I'm going to talk to you about a piece of work called Untouched Copy that was done in Kerala over 4 visits, during which I spent time in 22 photography studios. It's ethnographic research that looks at the agency of the photograph, the social relations of photography, studio photography within this area. It looked at the archives of the photographers. I interviewed the photographers, and at the time I didn't necessarily know what the body of work was going to be about. So this is just a kind of a drawing from my journal. What I didn't really think about at the time was, firstly, it was going to be a post-colonial conversation. Obviously, it was photography in this form went to India as a colonial export and changed and adapted for local community. I also didn't realise that suddenly I would become the exotic and I was in the photographs as much as the people I was photographing, the people I was having conversations with. So these are just a little bit about my process, really. I learned a lot about myself, the auto in a sense, being a big blonde white woman of a certain age going into a photography studio in India is obviously going to have a very different impact to being a local photographer. And I didn't realise it was interesting that I would be photographed. It challenged me, the particular area, this particular studio, this comes to mind now, in the bottom right. You can see a picture of a woman with a headscarf who's Mother Teresa. Now, growing up an Irish Catholic, to me that was like the epitome of, oh my God, that must be the most memorable thing in your life. Tell me about this story of photographing Mother Teresa. And after the 4th attempt of getting a meaningful conversation out of the photographer, he turned around and actually said, I can't remember it. It was just a job. It was many years ago. It's one of many jobs and I've forgotten it. And that kind of taught me a lot about myself and my projections as an outsider looking in, and assuming things that are important to me were as important to the people I was photographing. So this is just a taste of the ephemera that was collected around the research, or part of the research. And this body of work, Untouched Copy, came out of this research. It's 22 studio portraits in a sec with nobody in them. If I'm arguing, the reason I put Studioscapes at the beginning was to get you to think about, we're arguing that there's a kind of a method in the studio photograph, that you're surrounded by objects to which you aspire, you want to reflect that identity performance in a sense. If we take out the person and we actually look at what's going on in that studio, maybe we can find out a little bit more about what's aspirational within that space. And what I found, for example, Goa Beach was particularly popular in Kerala, which is about a 9-hour train journey away. And very interesting, because Kerala has very nice beaches in its own right. But I did see a repetition of Goa Beach, or I was told it was Goa Beach, in the studios. You'll also notice the plinths on the left, which you can see draws back to historical painting, and the flowers, which you'd also see in historical studio photographs. The titling is what the photographer called the backgrounds, and also when it was took to what the studio became afterwards. What I didn't realise at the time was it kind of became a testament or a legacy for a way of seeing and a way of making photographs that was becoming redundant. Digital was coming in. These studios were suddenly considered very old-fashioned. Who wants to go into a studio and have their portrait taken when, if you can do it on the computer, you can have a whole range of backgrounds? Why would you possibly want only one? What I liked about this one, for example, was the plastic seat was very reflective of the seats I saw in the area, yet we still had the flowers and the pillars and the picket fence. So I quite liked, in a sense, that hybridity that was coming through the backgrounds. this in particular ended up a real negotiation between myself and the photographer, who was quite happy to let me photograph himself, quite happy to let me photograph the space, quite happy to ask lots of questions. But under no circumstances was he going to be photographed next to that plinth with that flower on it, because that's a female prop. I didn't know that. So I thought that was kind of interesting, that it wasn't necessarily what the picture looked like, but what it was doing that I found interesting. Which I guess feeds in, because I can ran in a bit then, I have a background in anthropology and photography. And it was very common, I've taken a lot of these out, but I just wanted to give you a snapshot of it really, to have, if you're excuse me, if you're a photographer, you might also, in this case, I think he sold slippers along the side, so you might run a business alongside other things. Some photographers sold gems, some photographers sold slippers, some photographers were just photographers. But it was a very different way of understanding the context of photography and maybe the social relations of that practice within that community. The English garden I thought was particularly interesting, because I asked the photographer, well, what is it? And he couldn't understand why I didn't recognise it. I come from Britain, I am English, I speak English, yet I don't understand, I didn't recognise this. And you could almost see like this crestfallen, well, why doesn't she know it? That's England. In my imagination, this is what England has been like, and she doesn't recognise it. Anyway, in the broader practice, there's videos and interviews between us, but it gives you an idea of, in a sense, how the still images sit as an independent piece. And this is another piece that came out of the same research, called the Deportment Guides. And following along that argument, really, if we argue that the space tells us a lot about what we aspire within a particular community, what's happening in that photograph, if I then look at, I was collecting vernacular images, and I have a slight problem with using images of people that you don't know and reclaiming authorship, because the people in the photograph didn't necessarily agree to that collaboration. So I thought, well, actually, if I disguise the people in the photographs in a way that we don't know who they are, and we can actually look at the deportment of the people in the photograph. How are they standing? How are they holding themselves? How are they sitting? What are they wearing? You can equally find out a lot about the culture you're looking at without holding up a mirror and as somebody, as an object of that culture, if that makes sense. So these are a kind of a snapshot of the vernacular photographs I collected, studio photographs at the same time. Basically, I went back to the same places over 4 winters. I do think they were like, who is this woman that keeps turning up? And I think they politely agreed to work with me more than anything else. So you start to see things like the plinth, the books, the library, and if I hadn't rushed through, you start to see the patterns of those that can actually be drawn back to the conceptual framework of 18th century carte de visite photographs. Carte de visite, sorry. The mirror is quite important. That's a wedding outfit, so you can see the front and the back. So that's all well and good going across the world and making work about a culture you're not part of. But what happens if you do it on your own doorstep? So the last piece I'm going to show you, I don't know, I might have done this very quickly, but I just prepared just a 2-minute video in my local area. I live in North London, and it's considered traditionally an Anglo-Turkish area. I'm a, what would I say, I'm a geographical insider, but a cultural outsider. I know about photography. I worked commercially for a long time. And I was interested in the practices that went on in these studios that suddenly felt very unfamiliar to me. So having made the work in Kerala in southern India, I thought, well, let's turn the camera, let's start asking these same questions in my local community and find out a little bit more about what happens in commercial studio photography on the high street where I am. What I didn't realise is I'd be dipping into Orientalism and post-colonialism. But anyway, so this is a snapshot of one of the interviews with one of the studio photographers who's talking about the particular backgrounds that are being used in studio photographs in the studio she worked at the time. So what I've done here is I've jumped and we're now working digitally. So in theory, if you're restricted by a photography studio in terms of the space and what the space can do for you, if you're now using digital and you can put almost anything behind you, surely those decisions are even more critical than when the studio was put in front of you. So I was curious what backgrounds are fashionable, what backgrounds are popular, what sense can I make of that in terms of the values of the local community? So this is me having that conversation with one photographer.
Who chooses what background?
It really depends on the client, what they really want, or they can leave it to us if they want something really simple. But many Turkish community prefer things like Tower Bridge or things popular in London, just because they're going to send it to back home. They just want to show them they're living in London, basically, yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you was about the churches. You showed me churches, and I thought it was quite unusual for mainly Muslim clientele to be photographed in front of churches.
Yes, you're right. Like I said, it's not about the religion when it comes to pictures. They prefer to have something nice, like the way the architecture is done, and they've got picture if they're not dressed up in suit, if they want it to be in suits, so we can just put their head like these kind of things. Background for kids, it's more like kiddie colour, pinky butterflies, like full for kids, the things they will like. I would just have the picture slotting inside the frame, like this kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah, we just put the head in there as the rest. Yeah, something like this. Because like I said, they prefer things like that, really busy background, so basically getting their minds into our mind and try to figure out what they want, yeah.
So that's it, thank you very much.
Okay, so this is we're presenting together where Lena and I were paired, and then we actually weren't together physically because she was in Berlin and I was in Leeds. So we emailed and Skype together, but which means we've got a trace of the conversations we've had. And so what we decided to do was actually present some bits of the conversations we've had between us, but at the same time use that as a kind of structure from which to go on talking. So a lot of what you're going to see is not really rehearsed, it's actually responses to that conversation and things we thought of since and things like that.
So it's very much showing a process rather than a finished product, I think, or a finished result. It's just given an insight into what this collaboration or this collaborative process has been like, and maybe also like challenge the format. Do you need the notes though?
Oh yeah, I do. Okay.
Quickly though. Here we go. Right, so are you there, Lena? I mean, obviously it was a bit of a challenge to organize Skype sessions, and we would usually record them and transcribe them. So it's just an incentive to say, okay, the different formats of dialogue in a way. The written one, the performed one in a way, the bodily one, the difference in language in a way.
And the collaborative piece we're elaborating. So I think it's actually really exciting to also challenge the format of these symposium talks.
And it's more interesting for the audience if you have a variety of formats.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the video was supposed to be running, but it doesn't matter. You get an idea of us sort of being in that non-physical space in a way. Oh, sorry. It's a bit slow.
So another thing that I think we could talk about is gesture and touch.
So we'll show 2 videos now.
Yeah, what we've tended to do is pair or group works, because that's kind of what happened in the conversations.
Yeah, I think we were drawing links from the beginning, how our work or our practice eventually relates to each other. And we found that through difference, we actually encountered more similarity.
So the second one was my one. It was made with my long-term collaborator, Patricia Azevedo, who's Brazilian. And obviously they both have the titles, they both have balance in it. And we both seem to be using balance in a kind of interestingly similar way. So it's not balance as in a well-balanced load like in a lorry. It's not balanced like a person or a situation where there's some kind of equilibrium achieved and maintained. It's balance as something that's kind of not going to last. It's precarious. It kind of describes...
Less graspable maybe as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's not something you can point your finger on, I guess. It's very... I mean, within Equilibrar, Claire's video, the one with the water glass of water is very, it decelerates in a way, I think, as well. It's an approach of, it's sort of like decelerating that consumerist.
Felt very
gaze.
slow after yours, didn't it? Actually, it's funny seeing them one after the other.
Yeah,
yes, it really
true,
did.
Yeah, that's true.
Also, I think it's kind of describes a collaboration act really well.
Yeah, I was just going to say the collective act. I mean, that's within Balance Act. It's actually the German word for like balancing the how do you say the tightrope?
I could try. Yeah. Tightrope worker. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So it's a sense of stability and safety. You know, those notions where that maybe that game or that kind of rhythm that you move within. You know, within collective acts, it's never because so many people are involved in a way, or as soon as there's someone else, there's no full control. You have to seize and.
Yeah, even when you're trying to help the other person, you're actually throwing them out sometimes.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So finding that rhythm, I get very, very, very.
But unlike you say there's the kind of the tightrope walking thing, which is a notion of being high up on an audience. This is kind of very intimate, and so solo key is kind of almost silly. It's not got that kind of the grandness. There's just the camera there, and in your case, the camera.
Silly, I mean, like one of the things I think that came up a lot within our conversations was the sense of ordinary, like that everyday, that excerpt, or I don't know, highlighting the banal in a way that you wouldn't necessarily look at within a daily setting.
Yeah, we talked about the kind of things you do when you're just fiddling with something or waiting with something, those actions that are not even barely noticeable as actions sometimes,
And how they're driven as well, but we shall come to that. Right, so this is, I mean, I will send the text that has sort of like been since the first conversation. So, all right, I'll send you the text, like the transcriptions of the Skype conversation. So I think we wanted to point out that difference when it comes to formats of communication as well, which will link into other works that we're presenting, where body very much comes in as sort of like the transmitter, as the main element of the conversation or the dialogue.
Look, it's doing its thing.
Oh, yeah, and Claire spent hours transcribing, I think.
And you a little.
Yeah, so recognize oneself, and I think that's kind of the key word, because while looking for difference, like I said before, it was encountering a lot of similarities. And
we had a sort of disagreement about this, didn't we?
Yeah.
Or
True,
different interpretation of what's the word? What's the word?
I just come back to what Patricia said. Claire's collaborator, she always says, like, I don't understand, but I think it's really nice, or it sounds really nice. So it's kind of that, you know, that miscommunication that then turns into something that then becomes the fertilizer to something that's actually a difference, then turning into similarity or into common ground, maybe.
Yeah, and then sometimes you were arguing two ends of something, but actually you're realizing your focus is different, but you're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, so these are excerpts that sort of serve us as incentives in order to just keep that dialogue going right now in here. So if you want to throw questions at us, you can become part of it as well. That was spontaneous decision. I hope that's all right.
I meant to tell you that same thing as well.
Perfect. It's been like this for the past weeks. Brilliant. So yeah, the next video is Vinculos and to do with you. What I think is interesting about this one from this piece to do with you is there's a notion to me of there's a sense of fragile, how do you say, like something very fragile in it, because the pressure you have to, you can't use your body, in a way it's like contact improvisation, I guess, you know, like you, with what the other body sort of like communicates, but at the same time, because you connect the organs through something organic and through something, so, you know, if you squeeze it too hard, then it'll be probably not the aim that you were looking for. So what I'm getting at is that I really like that within to do with you, because it's again that collective setting, that collective act where you have to focus on that sort of balance. You know, it can go one way or the other, but it always sort of goes back into that not fixed balance, maybe.
Going back to the balance thing, it's very much to do with intimacy as well.
Yeah. And
so
allowing for that.
I think the link is with your previous work, the link, you know.
I think it's human nature. I think those instincts when you in that position balancing is it mandarins?
Yeah.
Why is it
because they're slightly more cushiony than an orange. An orange is really hard to hold, and it hurts by the end, and you're kind of holding that pose. But it's a practical thing because it shows up, and also because it's flattened, slightly spongy form. Yeah, you can. It's not as hard.
And it also indicates the amount of pressure then, right?
Yeah.
So you can really work with it as an indicator, I guess. Yeah. So within Vinculos, I think how these pieces connect is that it's again human nature and those instinctive reactions that we have. So
the human nature. They used the word human nature.
Oh yeah, I don't remember. What was it?
We were talking about universals. That's what we had our
universality.
About.
Yes, I remember that one. Yeah. So not universality as in unified, but as in including all the individuality there is.
Okay, yeah, we
maybe
sort of agreed on that one. Yeah.
That was the agreement, I think. So within Vinculos, what I went with a group of 20 people or so. We walked up a mountain. There were two conditions for that walk. We tried to hike to the peak. We were all connected by this fluorescent thread. So our bodies were connected, and we all had to move as one group, and we couldn't speak until we reached the peak. So it's that exploration, I guess, or that experimentation of like, okay, so how does human nature work? You know, if you walk too fast and the other person in the back's bothered sort of because or the other way around, you know, if the person, you get annoyed, but then, I don't know, entanglements, then you could see, I mean, this was just an excerpt, but you could see how two guys got into a little bit of a fight. They kept the silence, which I think was great, just for the exercise. There's again that interconnectedness, maybe.
Yeah, and the struggle.
Yeah.
So it's not as sort of harmonious necessarily. Kind of,
no, not at all. It's again that balance that goes, you know, it can sort of tend towards notion and the opposite as well. Right. Speech extract. This one is actually very, I think it's, I mean, I do love Claire's work, obviously. Speech extract is quite, it really like gets to me. I think it's a brilliant piece.
I should say.
And as it.
There you go. I should say it's part of a really old project. The projects I did to do with linguistic uncomfortableness and imperialism, to do with cultural inequalities, and I worked in languages that I couldn't speak in other people's countries.
Palate pa.
אני כבר בגלל שאומרים שנה שביעית.
אני שנה פנינו חשתפי.
שנה שביעית.
שנה שביעית.
ולקח לי שנתיים עד שתפסתי מזה הדבר.
וכאן שתיים ונסתי בפעם. הבנתי מדבר
היא שלא הגיעו מכתבים.
היא שלא הגיעו מכתבים.
כשראיתי את הפעם הראשונה, היה לי כאילו שאני לא מדברת עם בן אדם לגמרי נורמלי.
Whoops.
Is it? Well,
Maybe
how many
maybe-
languages are you actually using in that piece?
Just one.
Is it, because it's not Portuguese, is it?
It's Hebrew.
It was Patricia, I thought.
Oh.
It's very intimate, I think, you know, it's very public, but very intimate.
It's just well, actually, it was a kind of a fight, that one. They're all different,
Yeah.
but that one was a kind of...
I can imagine.
Yeah, there was a kind of real power thing going between the two of us.
And who came up with the sentences? Like, did you discuss it previously?
I'm not sure I have time to present. It's a big, complicated project, but in brief, I was presenting their words and what I was saying. So it was to do with
The audience?
No, the other person's
Right.
words. But usually the other person was hidden.
Yeah.
It ranged, it changed.
Well, what I thought, I mean, it really speaks of culture, like the experiences of unknown cultural settings, I might say, which is the piece I'm going to show now. I think that's how they both link, maybe.
I don't know I've forgotten what your next piece was.
Shall we have a look and then come back to recognise one? Stop it because I think we're running out of time, but basically that video probably needs a bit of explanation. It was done throughout a 2-week residency in Eastern Turkey, and the theme was to develop work within unknown cultural settings. So we went to Adana, stayed there for 2 weeks, big group of people from all different nationalities and backgrounds. And so since the theme was like, how do you develop work? Or how do you question your identity as an artist when you're in such unknown cultural settings? You know, it was geographical, like from habits, customs, language, and it was everything basically. So then I read Hito Steyer's The Language of Things, where she speaks about Walter Benjamin's, you know, how you ask these questions about what language does the fox speak, or how does the mountain communicate? So basically a notion where when you put things, objects into the world, they then develop their own language. So looking at the sense of identity, I thought, like, okay, this is way too much input. I need to get perspective first. So I realized that I was connecting to tradition there, which is kite making, and they usually fly the kites from the rooftops because too many cables on the street, etc. So I would spend a lot of time on the rooftops thinking about how would I adapt the language of the kite in order to narrate all these differences, I think, in culture. You know, like they would use their shoulders a lot to communicate, or I don't know, they would go like this. It's very, very much embedded, and they don't question it. But of course, I would realize for me, it was something new, you know. So
although we have talked about gesture,
yeah,
yes, interesting, yeah.
Well, you brought up gestures and touch, actually, so it's a way of bodies. Here we go.
To butt in, what about the satellite dishes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all linked into each other in terms of looking at the body as a narrator, sort of as a transmitter, in a way. Okay. You know, like how your body isn't isolated from the environment. I'm not sure if it reacts constantly, but it's in constant dialogue for sure. You know, like you would tense up for certain situations. You would, I don't know, specific gestures, facial expressions, or just this. You know, like I'm not even sure why.
How was that?
Yeah, maybe. So in a very different way, those two pieces I think connect to each other, because it's about the differences in language in a way.
But to me, they're connected because they're both to do with repetition. And I think
Oh, yeah.
repetition's doing something very different in those two places. Because mine is kind of positioning me as the pupil of an old style kind of learning situation where you have to learn by rote or repeat what the
So when you
teacher
say
said.
repetition in that sense, do you mean
I'm repeating
from
the
your
words and you're repeating, through editing.
right?
repeating
Not
the
as an
question.
experience, as when you say pupil, you know, like from the past into the present into the future.
No, I'm just how I'm repeating her words.
Yeah.
I'm repeating that woman's words and that's words. And you're repeating your gestures again and again and again.
Yeah.
But I think, and actually looking through this with you and sort of in advance when doing this thing together, I realised how much repetition is used in my work, and I hadn't actually that hadn't come out before.
Same thing happened with me with gestures.
Yeah.
I hadn't made the decision to use the word gesture, for example, for me.
I think one of the things we've done is, we're running out of time. We've got
Right.
a quarter of the way through. Let me say this. One of the things we've tended to do is bring the way we're looking at our own work to the way we look at the other person's work, and then that's actually widened out the other person's work for them.
Yeah.
Okay.
So should we wrap it up here? Yeah. Okay. Do I take this off?
Yeah, that's fine.
Right, halfway through, but nonetheless.
Okay, can I have the rest of the artists, please? Okay. Okay. I'm just gonna. I'll probably just let you guys start off, not really say too much, and obviously you guys can finish your conversation still. And if anyone wants to ask questions as well, that's all right too. So do intervene. I'll let you go, Sabrina. So you were saying you wanted to ask Ajamu some questions, didn't you?
Nice question.
Yeah, so a bit unfinished conversation is, here. I'm really interested in this business about pleasure as political, and I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that, Ajamu.
Okay. I think about how black queer lives are framed in terms of the context of the UK. I would argue that lots of our stories are framed around deficit model, i.e. something is wrong, right? Yeah. Our stories are always framed around questions around hard to reach, invisible, marginalization, issues around homophobia in black communities, racism in the wider LGBT community. It's very then rare that we are there within kind of the mainstream and kind of a mainstream narrative. So for me, pleasure comes back to kind of a sense of agency. So then, for me, it's then kind of not what's done to black bodies that's important, but then it's about what do I want to be done with my black body and to my black body, and then that then shifts the conversation to then think about our own kind of black bodies in a ways whereby everything that we talk about and do is we start from the center. So I'm basically kind of that's where pleasure for me kind of comes through. That's why I think kind of my politic around pleasure comes from. But then I also still think that because we're so locked into talking about sexuality, we don't talk about exactly what we're doing. So then actually, I'm saying it's around pleasure and the erotic, and then kind of what's that's doing, because basically I still think that there is kind of issues across the board around how we talk about kind of the body, including the black body, and sex and sexuality. So pleasure is there to still kind of to keep things kind of what's the word to find also, I think people are just intrigued and curious and voyeuristic as well. So then actually, for me, kind of, trying to talk about pleasure is also part of me kind of being kind of mischievous with my own kind of queer politic as well. Because I do think queer politic has lost something. I think it's lost that kind of energy that I kind of know queer politics was from around 80s, 97. Pleasure was, and then actually kind of not apologizing for being sexual beings neither. So that's where the politics kind of come from.
And I just want to ask you another question following on from that, and talking about that sort of joyous and that energy, but women are sort of, very absent from your work, but I know that feminism has actually been quite an influence on your work, and I wonder if you'd talk a bit about that.
Well, I think in the work that you've seen, there is kind of no women as such, but then there's kind of a questioning of gender. So then that's part of the work. And I think that I'm a lot kind of the early kind of artist work who I kind of really kind of liked, especially around the around the early 90s was folks like Joe Spencer's work, who I did lots of self-portraits, Ella Grace, who did lots of work around women, SM and kink, Finn's work, once again around kink and pleasure, and then also I'm a writer like Patayam Khalifa, who is now Patrick Khalifa, who I wrote a lot around kink as well, and then like key to my work is kind of Audre Lorde, in a sense, kind of her text and the erotic as power. So then that's been in a conversation with for like 20 odd years plus, yeah.
Yeah, can do. Stick you in the middle and ask you loads of questions. I think the reason I was interested in working with you was, one, we were both working with representation in studio, but in quite different ways. But I think more interestingly is you kept steering away from politics every time I mentioned, both when we had Skype conversation and when we actually met. You were very keen on the materiality of what you were doing as a process, and you were like, no, I don't want to talk about politics, I want to talk about what I'm doing and what I'm making. And I thought, it's so glaringly political work, I want to find out a bit more about that, really. A lot of which you've answered today, but I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Well, I don't think that the materiality of one's practice is not political. I think it's very political. I think for me, there's a way that I think when we talk about black and queer work, especially around visual medium, I think it's like locked into staid notions of identity and representation. So basically, my shift towards materiality then moves me kind of more towards one's practice, and one actually it's another conversation I want to have. That's part of the work. But then actually, when I sit in spaces with black and queer artists, they're rarely asked about the craft. They're only asked about the content of the work. And that's important, but then I think there's all the kind of conversation that we can have about kind of what we work with and what we do. So then that's my kind of shift towards materiality. But also then that shift isn't also because then I'm then also then reading kind of a lot more work by feminists, especially like Karen Arrad's work. So then actually kind of that's where my thinking is. I'm pushing towards kind of materiality and quantum and quantum mechanics and that kind of stuff, just as another way to come in or to radically rethink some of these ideas, and that totally moves away from object, subject, a lot of the kind of binary framework that I think lots of our work is locked into, and I think it is a potential route to move out of that framework. So then that's kind of the why I keep saying it's not that kind of politic, but then it is another kind of politic, and the politic then actually what it includes for me is still the body, and it's still kind of sensuousness. It still keeps the things that I'm kind of passionate about: tactility, touch, sensuousness. So really, it's very political, but in a different kind of a way. Yeah. If that kind of answers your question.
Yes. I was just curious, I suppose, because they were the conversations we were having.
Yeah.
I'm like, I want to know more about this, because that isn't a framework I would have necessarily thought of in the context you're right. So thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want to ask Caroline or me?
You don't have to if you don't want
No,
to.
I think my question is always going to be slightly mischievous. And it's around pleasure in the studio. How does it work for you or not? And if not,
So what do you mean pleasure? I mean,
pleasure. I don't always mean sexual pleasure, but then I'm talking about kind of pleasure could be kind of your rituals in working in the studio, how you work with the camera, set up the camera, work with people, the kind of things that you've photographed. That's the thing I'm kind of really kind of curious around, is your process and whether it's pleasure or joy and those kind of things that you can't quite grasp, but there's a feeling about it. How does that work?
The desire.
Sorry?
The desire.
Desire is part of it. Yeah.
As a way of production, as a way of process.
And then because the thing that I love about your work is that it's highly constructed, and so then that's a bit I'm drawn to, and the myth that you are out of the images. Then for me, then it's then what are the objects saying or doing, and basically it's then can those objects speak, and then if they are, what's kind of being said within the space with those objects. So then for me, it's then about kind of some of your work around kind of dealing with the non-human.
Okay,
So
you're right. Okay.
So then it's just me kind of thinking that I think there's something going on with and the materiality of those objects in that space that's also material as well.
I guess there's something about the material culture of those objects and the social relations, what they're facilitating for that sitter. And I know one question that came up when we spoke was, Karen, why don't you put people in your photographs? And it was like, actually, because I want to see what those photographs are doing. But to answer your first question, the pleasure for me is the knowing, is the finding out, is the conversations. Yet in the pieces I showed, you don't. But I have got some ethnographic video clips that kind of include it. So I guess the pleasure is the research and the finding out. And I guess the images are testament to that research. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense for me. I'm happy. So, same question.
Yeah. It's like a hunt. It's like a mystery. It's like trying to solve something. When I start making a piece of work, I'll start off with an idea, and I may or may not be working with someone else. If I'm working with someone else, they'll be bringing stuff into what I'm doing, so I start understanding more and more and more about what it is I'm doing. And if I'm working on my own as well, I'm very slow and listen to the project, and the project will start to tell me about what it is. And the whole process for me is complete joy, because it's like, it is the sublime. It is, you stop being who you are, and you are in another world when you're in that creative thing. So that's where the joy lies for me. Thank you.
I was just imagining something a collaborative piece would look like between Ajamu and Caroline.
I think that's what Maureen
interesting though, wasn't it? Because we're like the opposite ends of the same.
Like just one big merger. You can see it. I think it's easier with your work. I think it's actually very, very similar. So maybe you can continue a bit more of what you're going to finish up on.
You go. Where should I go? Where do we? Okay, so since we
talked a lot about. We talked about pleasure and joy quite a lot.
There was one part in the presentation. What if you hold on to this one? Well, let's call it dialogue. That was about desire, I think, and that it also links into what you were saying earlier. I think into that. How to phrase it? I think we use the word tension a lot. That it builds that tension, although it's very banal, but it engages you.
We talked about this as a loop, as a sort of self-evolving loop.
Yeah, like works that don't necessarily fulfill a purpose or make the grand gesture at the end, but the actual process is sort of like the masterpiece in a way, because it requires that engagement, I think. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, that's right. But in a way that was kind of a sort of anti-heroics.
Yeah.
So in a way you can have small scale, and there's a piece that unfortunately we didn't get to show where there's just a little bit of tape on the bottom of the door, and Lane is just moving the door, and it's just sticking to the carpet, and there's a real kind of joy in that, and yet it's nothing, and yet you kind of on a very physical level you know exactly how sticky that tape is, and exactly if the door's got a tiny chip in the bottom, and you know what, that it's just a cheap hollow door. It's a cheap hollow, but it's that kind of imagination with the physical that
then manifests the physical, although it's not physically present in a way.
Yes, I think for me, a lot of the video work that is about the absence of the things that you're thinking. It's about you put yourself in, make your video, you put yourself in a ridiculous position in a way where what you produce isn't physical, and yet it's talking about a longing for the physical.
But I think you do that in your work to. You managed to. I think it was said earlier, and I really like that sentence about the absence of the body, or the presence of the body through it being absent in a way. So I think that's what really struck me with your work as well, your whole thinking and working process in general. That you make. There was one piece that is called the tables. I mean, YouTube and Vimeo, you can check out Claire's work, and it balances a book on the table, and the book. Could you remind me of the title again? Because it's also about bodies.
It's the piece is called The Tables, because there's two tables involved. There's a table represented on the book, which is Alan Jones. The video, the sculpture of the woman in bondage gear with a glass.
So you can see that book or those bodies moving on a table that is moving as well. So it's in a way body as in the organically absent, yet it's very present because it's all about it. In a way.
I think, balance and instability again, of course.
Again, as usual.
Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
If anyone could speak on leisure and art practices, because pleasure and leisure seem to rhyme. So I was just, as I was listening to you all, it just occurred to me that there might be something in that. Okay, in this, anyway, as in maybe freeing ourselves from one particular kind of labor into more spacious labors that art practice allows us to inhabit. Am I answering the question myself?
You are. It's a really interesting suggestion. Knock the P off, and then what do we have? Yes. I don't. No, you've answered it.
Sorry.
Thanks. Hi. This one's for Claire. I was really into your insistence on holding on to the points of disagreement in the conversation between you two. And you've had this long-standing collaborative relationship and have worked in collaboration for a long time. Like, does that holding on to the disagreement, is that overtly political, or is that like how do you think about that?
It's kind of practical in a way, because it's part of what's between you, and sometimes there was one period when I was working with Patricia Azevedo, and it turned out a lot of our work was about tensions, but it was kind of about. It seemed to be about kind of mapping in space, but there was a lot of it was about tension and release, and it was actually just the process of evolving ideas, and any set of discussions have points of agreements and points where you put actions, and the one's as useful as the other in terms of developing where you're going to. Yeah.
Hi, I wanted to ask Caroline. I don't know if you mentioned it, but did you say why India, or why were you there doing the project?
It's a good question. I didn't say it because short time. It kind of happened by accident. It happened originally on a holiday with some friends, and I got chatting to a local photographer about the cost of beer, and I have a background in photography, and I was interested in how photography sat within a culture I was unfamiliar with, and I'm always slightly suspect of particularly Westerners that go on holiday and want to make comment about work in countries they don't come from. But I thought, well, actually, I do know about photography, but suddenly I don't know about photography, so I want to use this as a kind of a nucleus to find out. What I didn't know at the time is the state I was in was a alcohol-free zone, so the association with beer was completely different. So it was almost a random, but what I was quite keen to do is once I kind of worked out, well, this is kind of interesting. I've had this conversation with this guy. There's 6 photographers. They're all on the same street. They're cross-competing. I wanted to keep it local. I didn't want to make a big statement about a huge continent. I wanted to kind of keep it in one village and see what I could find out about that village by looking at one thing. In a sense, you could do the same ethnographic research with food and talk about food and how food facilitates different behaviours, but I don't know very much about food or cooking. I know more about photography, really. So that's why it started, really. And I think once you start scratching at something, then you start to see links elsewhere with work.
The reason I was asking is because I thought, have you thought about because I think you talked about colonization and how you, do you have any thoughts on how would you link what you were doing in India with that?
Well, yes, and I've done quite a lot of. I'm actually doing a PhD, so I've looked a lot around the history of studio photography, and it was a colonial export. And I think early studio photography in India was categorised poor people in I use inverted commas here, and then there was a wave of copying the colonisers, the British, and what they did in studio photography, and that somewhere in particular there was a switch where local photographers actually started to empower and choose to make images that reflected what their community wanted. I think in particular Chris Pinney writes a lot about this. He's an anthropologist at LSE, and he writes very convincingly about the Taj Mahal and actually how that as a background in a studio better than going to the Taj Mahal, because it represents love and romance. So actually you don't need to go to the Taj Mahal, you could just have it in the background because it says the same thing. So I guess the same concept of studio photography is still being used, but the visual tropes have changed and adapted with the local culture, which I then would argue is a post-colonial conversation.
Yeah, the thing is, like, I got the feeling that that project and the one you showed, like, in the digital studios, like, after, kind of feel that they have this, or, like, they're using that same colonizing attitude, you know, because I don't know, that when you were showing, like, the backgrounds in the video, and then people were some people were laughing at it, I don't know, I just kind of thought that this was they had this cultural, I don't know how to say it, like this attitude, dominating cultural attitude, you know, well, in the way you were documenting and showing these things to us, and like some people were laughing, and I thought, like, for example, if I had taken this picture or my photograph with one of these studios or backgrounds, like, how would I feel? And you know, to see that people are actually framing me in this laughable thing or as an exotic thing. And I think what you showed us is mostly part of the popular culture. You know, like, it's embedded in this, I think, very fragile social tissue. And I think I mean, of course, what you were saying, it's clear to me that your intentions are like more like documenting and good intentions, and I think that you might want to think of it that way, you know, like how you're not being this colonizing person going there for taking photographs of exotic things to you and then putting them here in this context. And, you know, I think we need to be aware of that, you know, because I think even in I don't know, popular culture, say social media, that there's been recently some critics and some awareness. People take selfies when they're doing humanitarian work and stuff like that, and they're like these saviors, and I think it kind of plays in the same way. I don't know if I was like the only one who felt it that way.
I think there is an argument that it is uncomfortable to laugh at something that a culture you don't sit in. I think that's a fair point. And I think in terms of a public showing of the work, I have to think very carefully about how I frame what context that's shown in. I think that's agreed. But I think within there, I'm not quite sure if that was a comment or a question.
I think it's more, an observation probably, because I don't know if I was the only one who had that reading of the work, but I thought it was like a little bit like that, like from this, like not being really aware of what you're actually documenting.
I think it's difficult when you only see a snapshot of something to make that call, really, in a sense, because these are long-term research that has involved going into people's houses, looking at photo albums, taking pictures of their walls. They've come to my home.
But then that's exactly what I'm meaning, because, like, well, you didn't show any of these things, but it's just, I think, the approach as artists or as researchers who come to this place, like you said, you're a cultural outsider. It's just like the way you deal with these things, I think. I mean...
Oh, right, okay.
I think for me, when we look at images, we always have to deconstruct how we look at those images first of all. And so I think that we have to be mindful in terms of what we see might be there, but it might not always be there neither. And I think for me, it's kind of not always going to be this either or, but then actually, as an artist, for me, it's one kind of how do we hold these very complex tensions, right? And that means that actually we kind of always kind of work it through. And so really, it's then kind of all these kind of tensions are always already entangled. And I think then how we kind of want to deconstruct it is that we then want to line it up neat and tidy. So when it does this politic or that politic, I think it's far more complex than that. And so really, I think it's how does the artist hold those tensions and then work through it. But then also you might not find answers that you want to work it through neither. And I think for me, kind of, that's where I kind of sit. And so really, I'm the reason why I'm drawn to the work is because it does that move, yeah, right, and because I'm clear, not clear, that's why I'm drawn to the work, yeah, right, and so really, it's then how then do you then really kind of inhabit that kind of muckiness around our practice, around those politics and those kind of ideas. That's my kind of position.
Yeah, I mean, and I wanted to say more or less the same, which is I think that Caroline's work raises those questions and makes the viewer very aware of those tensions, and you know, so yeah.
I don't know. I just thought that the fact that people were laughing at these things, I mean, it's nothing personal or anything, but I think that proves kind of like the point I'm trying to make, that maybe like the material you have, maybe it's not.
I think it's more acknowledging your process, your inner process, and I think also the processes of audience. We talk about processes of artists or producers of work, but I think more attention needs to be placed in how audiences are impacted and affected, and what comes up in them, and how that gets processed. But I think your whatever you experience or witness in the work is valid. Because. But I think what Charnley was making is that there's no clear-cut
and I think that also,
and it's not the responsibility also of the artist to necessarily fix all the collective problems that are in the field, so to speak, because it's unresolved on a collective level.
Can I add quickly that also we have to also be aware that, and we also have to be aware that there's many different kinds of laughter as well. So basically one I'm then asked to then got to then deal with those individual people and ask, you know, what made you laugh as well, without then kind of I'm making this assumption that because one hears laughter, the laughter means this. One has to then also deconstruct that as well.
Can I just make a point? I think I really agree with, I don't know your name, but kind of looking at your pictures, it did actually kind of raise a couple of points. One is that you've cut the eyes or the kind of the person out of the frame, which I can understand within the context of research it might work, but as a viewer, I can also kind of put another layer to it. But also, I think in terms of the point you were trying to make, I think is quite right, because when I exactly the same feeling as you, that you went to India and then when you came to Britain, you went into a space where there was cultural kind of readings. We can read into it, and I think the laughter. I was aware of the laughter. I think you might have wanted to take it into a, if you are saying what you're saying, I think the next step might be interesting is for you to go into a completely British setting and take your photographs there. And I think it would have provided us with a more of an equal kind of way of spectatorship, our relationship to the photograph. But I really did think you did pick two cultural settings, very specific. And I think I found that very uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. That's my honest opinion. Completely agree.
Okay, so we're going to probably have to end, okay, because we need to have a very, very short break and we've got still 2 more halves to go. So thank you very much, everyone, for... Ikenna, sorry, go for it. Very, very quickly.
This was actually for Ajamu, and I don't know, it might be another... I guess for me, my assumption is when a lot of people encounter your work, there's discomfort. I shouldn't say a lot of people, but some people will be discomfort. And because it's the art world, there's an expectation that we're supposed to be open-minded. And so my question to you is, how does that discomfort get communicated to you, or do you pick up on it, or is it something that you sort of notice and either respond to or record?
Sometimes I respond and I don't respond. I think for me, the question is around kind of why do people find certain kind of images in terms of around discomfort, right? Yeah, right. And I think for me, I find it interesting that if it's around sex and sexuality, something else kicks in, right? Yeah, as opposed to images of justice, and that does another kind of move. And so really, I think for me, the issue for me is what we project onto the photographs, and then what then are those images triggering, and then what else then is then going on in terms of your relationship to the image, yeah, right? And then yes, I am aware of the fact that yes, I can produce around racist response. Of course it can. I recognise that it can produce around homophobic response. And so then I'm very aware of the different kind of lenses that people can look at the work, but then actually that's why I do the work, because I still have to tell a certain kind of narrative around my experience. So then actually, end of the day, the work has got to do a certain kind of a move and to address certain kind of ideas and concerns that I think that we're still not talking about, or we sidestep. Yeah. So then actually, if someone feels some kind of aware, right? Yeah. Right. What else is going on? And I think there's something about talking about pleasure and sexuality in this country that still does it. Not just with black bodies, but with certain kinds of white bodies too. And so hence, kind of that's what the work is there for. And then, you know, if it makes you feel a bit odd or whatever, fine. Fine. Because actually, what I'm talking about, I know you're doing.
It was just, it was beautiful when I met up with Ajamu. When I met up with Ajamu in Cafe Nero in Brixton, the lady sitting next to us took her cake and removed herself from our conversation. So I don't think people like those people talking about sex in public.
I guess it's one of the last taboos, isn't it, really?
Okay, all right, thank you. Right, so we're going to have a really, really short break, like 5 minutes, and we're going to start up again. We've got 2 great sessions to come.